Hello and welcome to another exclusive interview by Recovery Today magazine at recoverytodaymagazine.com, where first and foremost, we are a magazine of hope. Whether you're considering addiction recovery for yourself or a loved one, or you're actively in recovery a short while or many years, you'll find information on all topics related to addiction, recovery, and living a happy, successful, sober life at Recovery Today. My name is Sherry Gaba, and I am the editor of Recovery Today, and I have the distinct pleasure to introduce you to another amazing guest, and her name is Dr. Joanne Cacciatore, who is a research professor at Arizona State University with nearly 70 published studies and directs the graduate certification in Trauma and Bereavement. In 1966, she founded the MISS Foundation, an international NGO that aids families whose children die or are dying. And in 2016, she founded Selah Care Farm, one of only 3 care farms in the United States, and the first care farm, I keep saying care farm in the world for trauma grief. There, grieving families from around the world come to receive counseling, learn healthy coping, and help care for almost 40 animals, farm and domestic, rescued from torture, homelessness, and abuse. Her book, Bearing the Unbearable, Love, Loss, and the Heartbreaking Path of Grief, won the Indies Book of the Year Award and is available on Amazon. Well, welcome, Joanne. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Sherry. It's a pleasure to be here and talk.
Yeah, I was referred to by our good friend, Eric, excuse me, and wasn't sure at first, grief, and then it kind of made a lot of sense, right? Because, it's funny. I'll tell you a little bit. I did hospice for 5 years. I was a hospice social worker. So I sort of understand anticipatory grief. And it's really funny how my career morphed into recovery. So there's so many parallels, because when you're an addict alcoholic, for them, the losses of your drugs or your alcohol, and for the family, of course, it's the loss of your loved one to the disease or, God forbid, a passing. So it's kind of interesting. Our paths are sort of crossed a little bit.
Well, and I think there's another aspect of this that's very important. And that is that it's not unusual for me to meet people who struggle with using substances or abusing substances who have had loss in their past. Mm-hmm. And they did not know how to stay with the pain of those losses.
Right.
And as a result, became addicted to a particular, in many cases, it's a substance, prescription or street, or alcohol. But in some cases, it's pornography or shopping or food or television or any of the other isms, that you can imagine. Because staying with something like traumatic grief it takes a lot of work. And we're I call it our culture, the happiness culture. And we're very focused on feeling good, and we don't teach people how to feel sad.
So true. And, when you said that, I thought of many cases of mine where they've lost their friends to ODs,
Sure.
To overdoses. So you're right. It's all around them. And I'm wondering how you got into traumatic grief, and is the modality your care farm, or do you have other modalities you work along with the care farm?
So, okay. So let me break this into 2 parts then. How I got into traumatic grief is because I experienced the death of my own child in '94. And it sort of catapulted me into a world I didn't want to be in. It's an unspeakable pain and an unspeakable grief. But I also knew in my heart intuitively that I had to do it honestly. And so while I was offered a lot of drugs, prescription street, I was offered a drink a lot. That just wasn't for me. I just knew that I had to feel this pain honestly. And so then I grieved and I endured and suffered. And so about 2 years after she died, I started the foundation, which is an NGO. And then I went back to school and I got a couple of bachelor's degrees, master's degree, and a doctorate.
You got a doctorate. Oh my God. In what?
I'm actually a tenured professor. So that's my, sort of paying job. I'm a tenured
Wow. Professor. Okay. That's amazing.
Oh, well, thank you.
Well, it's amazing when you take something that is a loss and turn it into something like that. I mean,
Yeah, well, I mean, look, you don't remain unchanged when catastrophe strikes. When someone you love more than anything in the world dies, you are not unchanged. It either makes your life smaller, or if you can learn to stay with the feelings, stay with the pain, stay with the emotion, it makes your life bigger.
Yeah.
And for me, I just wanted to honor her and wanted to be able to bring her love to the world. And there was no way I would have been able to do that if it had made my life smaller.
Yeah.
So I worked really hard. I don't mean to trivialize it by making it sound easy. It was a lot of work. But then I started the foundation, went back to school, got all that done, and then started the care farm. So in terms of modalities, I'm not even a really big, I don't even use that word. So I love people through their pain, and I teach them how to stay with it. I teach them to be with it. I'm a Zen priest, so I teach contemplative practice, meditation, contemplative prayer. I teach them to be in nature. I teach them how to go into the pain and stay with the pain and trust themselves with the pain and not have to take themselves out of the pain, using all of the clever things that we do to avoid our own pain, which then actually causes more pain, right?
The world of distraction really is what
it's a world of distraction, and it's a world of superficialities. And so I teach people to go deep and stay deep and to be with it, and then let it transform them. I mean, look, there's no panacea for this. There's no quick fix for something this catastrophic. And most of the people I've met who are coping with life's both, life's adversity, but also life's catastrophe sometimes, who are using substances to cope. They don't want to. They just don't. They don't trust themselves with their own emotions because it's never been modeled, because they lived in a family system that was avoidant, that didn't talk about it. That energy has to go somewhere. We have to do something with it, or we have to numb out.
Yeah,
absolutely. And that's, and the sad thing to me is then we blame the person, right, rather than the society that doesn't allow a person to feel. Look, if we're telling people you can't feel, you're not allowed to feel what you authentically feel, then they have to force themselves to feel something different.
Mm-hmm.
And then we blame them for forcing themselves to feel something different. And the reality is, if we could teach people how to create space for others' pain, for their suffering, not to rush them, to create a circle of compassion, some place for them to land softly in the world. If we can do that, then people start to learn, okay, I can lean into this pain, I can turn toward this pain, and it will not annihilate me. And it's sad, that we live in such a culture that's so superficial that everybody has to pretend to be happy all the time.
Well, when I did hospice, and then I was working even before hospice in these nursing homes, it was all about keeping advanced directives where they would be, life support. There wasn't really talk about, choices. It's one thing if you're educated and you have a trust lawyer and you can work with these issues about death. But in general, our society, all I saw really, and the same with when my father died of cancer, nobody wanted to talk about palliative care. Nobody wanted to talk about dying. They just wanted to talk about solutions on keeping him alive. And, there's no dignity around the death, and death, you can have dignity around death. I mean, at least I experienced that in my career.
Yeah, well, most of my work isn't actually with elders who die.
I'm just using that as an example. As society in general, we just don't deal with death.
Yeah, they don't deal with death. They deal even less with grief.
And less with grief, right? Exactly.
I mean, now we have death cafes popping up, but but the reality is, grief is just something no one wants to touch, especially when it's traumatic. If it's suicide, homicide, drug overdose, the death of a child at any age and from any cause, it is, you can clear out a room pretty quickly. And so these messages from society, these external messages, become internalized. The messages of, don't talk about that, don't feel that way, you should be feeling better by now. Why are you still holding on to that your dad died when you were 5? All of these messages. And so the person starts to doubt him or herself and his or her own emotions. and that is a recipe for disaster, actually, and just an invitation to some type of a distraction that usually then becomes an addiction.
Well, like you said, it becomes a recipe of suffering.
Yeah.
So, of course, because this is a recovery magazine, I'm wondering, like, what particular things you do. Partially, you've talked about it with the survivor. And, what would you say to someone about learning to let go of the need to control? We work with a lot of families, and a big issue, I think, around not being able to let go is the need to control the outcome, control the grief, control how they're supposed to feel about the grief. So I guess the question is around control. How do you ultimately help someone let go of control of a loved one's disease or death?
Yeah, I think some of those questions are very difficult to answer because it's so nuanced, Sherry. I mean, so for example, if it's your parent who is addicted, then usually the children get something called parentified. So if you have a parent who, for example, is addicted to alcohol, you end up with a younger child or a teenager or an adult who is then parentified and feels the obligation to take care of the parent. And so, yes, of course, the child feels like, some of why we control is fear.
Right.
If you're talking about a parent with a child, depending on the age of the child and the nature of the relationship, I think it's natural to want to control. And that comes usually from a place of love, but also fear, right? Because that strikes terror in the hearts of parents to think, what happens if my child overdoses? What happens if my child becomes addicted to this drug or this substance or even this prescription drug, and then I can't, it's a tragedy from which we can't extricate ourselves and then dies. That strikes terror in the hearts of people. So I completely understand the desire for control. It's a complicated thing. And so I will admit my limitation is in that area, is that I don't do actual substance abuse treatment.
That's okay.
Yeah. What I do, though, is help people be with their emotions. And then when they learn they can trust themselves with the emotion, they no longer need to drink that bottle of wine every morning and every evening, or smoke the joint 6 times a day, or shooting the heroin. It no longer becomes necessary to leave our emotions. So the best way that I help people is through helping them feel. Now, for the parents or the other family members or loved ones, spouses, etc., who are in a situation with someone who's addicted to a particular substance, the reality is, until that person gets in a place where that person feels safe enough to explore what he or she feels deeply, the trauma of the past, in most cases, this is what it is. It's not always, but in most cases, it has been my experience. And of course, Gabor Mate is
the bomb.
Yes, yeah. And he's one of my dearest friends. And, we have these conversations all the time. He agrees. He very, very rarely meets an addict who doesn't have trauma or grief in the past. And so we have to, as people who love them and care about them, we have to find a safe place for them to go, to talk about their pain, to be with their pain, to process what happened to them, to confront the unfathomable, because that's the reality. Their reality is what most of us fear and can't be with. And so, I understand the feeling of the need to control, and certainly people want to get treatment, but if treatment doesn't include deep emotional work around their pain and loss and grief, as far as I'm concerned, it's completely pointless and utterly useless.
Exactly. No, I love what you're doing, and I think you're absolutely right. I don't know any addict or alcoholic that hasn't had some sort of trauma, some sort of grief, and in addition, the parent who is, right now, my daughter and my 3-year-old granddaughter is getting on an airplane in about, I don't know, any minute now, and you just think about things. You want to control everything. You think about these things. You don't want to think about these things, but anything's possible. Anything can happen. I guess that would bring me to my next question is, when my dad died, I read a lot about afterlife. And if this gets too woo-woo, we don't have to go there. And, we can even, but I thought because of the thing you have in the back of your backdrop there. And I thought, I read a lot about afterlife. So and there's a really great book that a girlfriend of mine wrote because her son was an addict and died. And she talked about him being an empath and how he wasn't ready to be in this lifetime and he had to do more work in the afterlives and, on and on and on. And so I'm wondering if you have some thoughts around that because you are around people that are grieving someone.
Oh yeah, for sure. So, I'm a scientist. I'm a statistician. Okay. So I'm a pretty rational person, but I have had some very, very deeply spiritual experiences that defy explanation.
Exactly.
And I always leave myself open to all possibilities. I'm not hubristic. I'm not arrogant enough to think that I know what happens after this place.
Yeah.
The caution that I use for people is, in using spirituality to bypass our emotions.
Yes.
Right. And so the key is, even if my child who died is in Disneyland heaven and it's the best place, she's still not where she belongs with me. And so I'm still going to feel the sting of her absence. And that it's important for me to be able to feel that even if I have hope that someday I'll see her again. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Oh, I love it. I mean, it's absolutely right because otherwise you are bypassing the feelings and then you're living in sort of an esoteric, not real world. You're kind of in a delusion in a way. If you're just thinking, oh, there she is, I'm speaking to her, and you don't think about I wish she was grounded here with me.
Yeah, I mean, you may be speaking with her in the spiritual sense, and that may be some solace. And also, you're a mother, and you miss her, and you're allowed to miss her. You're allowed to crave the smell of her hair and the touch of her skin, and her voice saying "I love you," or her little 3-year-old arms around your neck. You're allowed to miss that.
I love that you do caution people because I know for me when my dad passed, and that was the hardest thing I'd ever been through. And again, it's nothing like losing a child that I was very attached and bonded to my father much more than my mother.
Loss, Sherry.
It was really, he was such a great person. And I just was addicted to talking to mediums for a while. And then I realized he came to me and he's like, could you get on with your life, please? And let me get on with mine up here. And it was just so clear. And so I stopped doing that. But for a while, it kind of got me through the beginnings. But, eventually I had to really grieve. I mean, if you're distracting with anything, then my mother met a guy and she had a boyfriend that was horrible. And then I had to start dealing with that. I wasn't grieving my dad. Yeah. And, you're right. You're absolutely, because it's going to show up one way or the other, whether you get sick.
Yes. And the thing is, when you do grief, honestly, you understand what's happening. But grief is a clever thing. It's a clever it's a clever ball of emotion. If you don't deal with it directly, it will deal with you and it will become subversive. And when it's subversive, then it disguises and it comes in the back door and you have no idea what you're dealing with then. And then it really collapses your world. It's like a house of cards, right? It all comes down at some point. Here on the care farm, recently I worked with a woman whose baby died at 48 years ago. Mm. And she's been, using drugs, using alcohol, moving, changing jobs, 8 marriages, just all of the things that we do to try to, out move our emotional pain. And, finally she said, I realized this is what I was doing and it's time for me to do the work.
Do they live on your farm or do they come?
Not yet. We're in the process. We're in fundraising. We actually will build a respite house here. Right now, they just usually stay at Airbnbs near, but it's just day programs right now. So families come from all over the world, Cambodia, Argentina, New Zealand, Australia. Yeah. Today we have a family here from Colorado. We have families who come from all over the United States.
So you have many practitioners and an actual program that they sign up for?
There's 4 of us 4 counselors who work here. And we do all kinds of things. We have animals. We have 39 rescued animals, rescued from horrible torture and abuse to homelessness. And So some of it is animal, some of it is nature-based, some of it is contemplative. I and Gemitsu, one of our Roshis here, teach meditation. So we teach people how to stay, everything is grief-centered. Everything is about staying with the grief, being with the grief, fully inhabiting it, and then learning to integrate rather than disintegrate.
Right.
Because rather than fragmenting and cutting ourselves off from authentic parts of ourselves.
And how long is the program for?
Oh, it depends. Everyone is different. So it's highly, highly personalized.
Oh, okay.
So some people come for 2 days. Some people come for 1 day. Some people come for 2 days. Some people come for 3 months.
Wow. Where are you located?
We're just outside Sedona, Arizona.
Oh, I'd love to meet you. I'm going to Sedona probably for Thanksgiving. I'd love to say hi if you're around.
We'll see if we can make that happen.
Yeah, I love, this is really amazing. This is beautiful.
And I did a small pilot study, of course, because I'm a researcher, so I collect data. And so I did a small pilot study to look at not only the pre-post effect of the Care Farm as an intervention, but also, qualitative and interviewing people and how it helped them several weeks after they left. One of the things that we found was a dramatic reduction in their traumatic grief score. So in particular, avoidance, their sort of avoidance, which we know is not useful. And then the other thing that we looked at was coping. So we included in the questionnaire questions about coping. How able are you? So you have these painful, grievous feelings and all of these emotions. And yes, that might be on a scale of 1 to 5. Those might be a 5. But how able do you feel to cope with those emotions?
Yeah.
And so not only did the intensity of their distress decline slightly, though significantly, statistically speaking, but their coping significantly increased. And that's where the real magic is, because the reality is when you've had a catastrophic grief, it's not just, you're going to grieve for the rest of your life for this person you love who died. So just dealing with the symptoms of grief is very reductionistic and narrow, because it's going to present and represent itself for the rest of your life. The key becomes in helping people learn how to cope with those emotions when they present and represent themselves.
So what if it's not grief like death grief, but actually like the death of a relationship? Like, do you work with people that are dealing with?
I don't. And it's not that that's not grief. That is grief, but it's a whole different kind of grief. And I'm busy as it is, so I don't need any more work.
You basically are staying in the death grief.
A traumatic grief. Traumatic. Is what I do. So I don't do generally speaking, someone who's, 105-year-old grandma died doesn't generally come to me.
Right.
I work with families whose children are murdered. I work with families, a father who completes suicide. Sometimes I work with the children in the family. I work with people whose babies die of stillbirth or sudden infant death syndrome, or whose children die of cancer. I work with catastrophic loss. There are other people who are quite skilled at doing those other things, but this is a real niche. And, if your 18-year-old daughter has been raped and murdered, it takes a clinician has to be quite skilled to be able to hear the details of that story.
Yeah.
And needs to have done his or her own very, very deep shadow work in order to really help this person. So it's just a different genre, and it's very, very specialized. And this is all I do ever.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for, explaining that, and thank you for what you're doing. And I want to make sure people can find you. So what's the best way to find your book and your program and your the place that you work at?
Yeah. So it's Selah Care Farm, SELAH, carefarm.com is the Care Farm. And my website is just myname.com. And then if you've lost a child and you want support, the MISS Foundation, MISSfoundation.org is the nonprofit that I started. I want to go back just very quickly. I do want to acknowledge that when I talk about people allowing themselves to grieve, I do agree that even the loss of a relationship, we still have to grieve that. We still have to give ourselves space to grieve for the loss of a relationship or the loss of a dream. Grief, to some extent, grief is grief. I happen to work with catastrophic death and grief. And so if you're grieving, find someone who understands. If you're grieving the loss of a relationship, find someone who understands that so that you can learn to stay with your painful feelings around that.
Exactly. I agree with you. What would you say then to that family member that might be listening to this interview who has lost someone to an overdose or alcoholism?
The first thing I would say is I am profoundly, deeply, not in a trite or platitudish way, profoundly and deeply sorry. And please get support for what you're enduring. There is no grief like the grief when a beloved family member dies in such a way. My book is usually it's around $10 on Amazon. It's most people have found it to be incredibly useful.
Great.
Pick up a copy of the book and read it. The chapters are really, really short because I understand that grief brain is a real thing. So usually the chapters are 2 or 3 pages. Take it slowly. Let yourself feel as you're reading it. You'll feel things deeply for sure. It's an evocative book.
Yeah, I didn't think I thought I was going to end there, but I do have one more question. How do you know when it's time to do the deep work? Because I know for me, when I joined a grief group immediately after my dad died, I was not ready. It really wasn't helpful. So how does someone know, like, okay, it's time?
Yeah, I don't think you can see, because everyone is so different. I don't think you could put a time limit. I think here's my sense. My sense is that when it feels like everyone else is going back to life as normal, then find someone who understands that life is not normal for you. Right? Because at some point the world, the meal trains stop, the sympathy cards stop, the flowers die and they stop coming. And at some point everybody goes back to life as usual, but your life is not usual. And everything has changed inside out, upside down. And so pay attention to what's happening inside of you. And the reality is, if you get the right kind of help, I have never worked with someone who said this was too soon. And I've done crisis intervention. So I've worked with people from the moment they were disconnecting perhaps their child from life support to 5 years later.
Yeah, this is important work. Without going into great detail, my mother made a terrible choice after my dad died, which was a distraction. And it really affected our whole family on such a profound way. And we are still in court dealing with this situation. So whether it's drugs, alcohol, love addiction, like you said, shopping, debting, whatever, we live in a world of distraction, and people just don't want to accept the moment of the grief.
Yeah, no, they don't. No,
and
they expect you to be happy.
Right.
There's an expectation that everything is fine. How are you? Fine. Move on.
Exactly. And no, it's not that simple. So thank you, Joanne, so much. And I will, I really appreciate this, and I'll let you know when this beautiful interview will be published.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you.
All right. Bye.